have a panel discussing this book. The panel will include Ziaul Salam, who is Associate Editor at Frontline, Manisha Sethi, who is Associate Professor at Jamia Millia Islamia, and Irfan himself, who is, of course, Senior Research Fellow at the Max Planck Institute, Germany. The session will be moderated by Siddharth Vadrajan, Founding Editor of The Wire. Before we begin the panel, may I please invite Honorable Hamid Ansari, former Vice President of India, to kindly release the book and say a few words.
Well, Irfan Ahmad Saab and everyone on the panel and friends, I claim no knowledge of philosophy or sociology of religions. I do know from the history of religions that they all began as critiques of the existing order, ended up as new orthodoxies, and were subjected to heresies sooner or later. This book, to my understanding, is a response and refutation of the suggestion of Western scholarship that, unlike the Bible in the post-17th century Europe, Islam has not been subjected to what has been called the higher criticism of the word behind the text or the context in which a particular form of words were articulated. Religion as critique has to ensure that apart from pure critique and higher criticism, of which there is a good deal in the book, societal correctives are not hampered by tradition, and patriarchy on grounds of alleged theological constraints is not invoked. Irfan Ahmad Saab has worked on a very complex subject with great diligence, and I am sure this book would be read by scholars, not just here but all over the world, for an approach that he has sustained throughout the book. Thank you very much.
So before I introduce the book, let me thank OUP for making this event possible. In particular, I want to thank Chandrima Chatterjee, Iti Khurana, and Shivangi. I'm thankful to the audience for their presence. To the distinguished panel, I thank for reading the book and agreeing to participate, and I look forward to their reflection. Finally, I'm grateful to the respected Hamid Ansari Sahab to formally release the book and saying his observations. Among the audience are some people who matter to me, and I want to especially thank Professor Abhijit Pathak, a brilliant teacher who shaped a whole generation of sociologists. I also wish to mark an absence here. I wish my parents were here. Now let me say something about the book. Unlike the distinguished panel, I have actually not read Religion as Critique. And when I say this, it is not like a Bihari trying to crack a joke. It is actually true. To be more precise, I have not read it ever since it was published. Therefore, it is easy as well as difficult to say something about the book, but here I try. So it deals with two core issues, reason and critique. These issues are central to the modern Western knowledge apparatus. Generally speaking, the Enlightenment in Europe is taken to inaugurate both reason and critique. I question such a position that runs from textbook to handbooks and from restaurants to parliaments against the established thought which equate critique and reflexivity with modernity. I take it back to the axial age when Moses, Buddha, and later Christ and Muhammad ascended as reformers, critics. In Islamic tradition, as enunciated in the Quran, critique or tanqeed or intiqad or naqd in Urdu pertains to reform, islah, for the pursuit of which Allah sent his prophet. And this role later on is taken by ulama, who are often wrongly translated as clerics. In terms of method, the book is interdisciplinary. One key strand of literature is the new field of anthropology of philosophy. When one talks about reason and critique in India, Amartya Sen's argumentative Indian often is mentioned. Sen surely talks about India, so do I. However, we both talk about a different India and quite differently. Sen and his commentators like Ramchandra Guha and many others either erase Muslims from their accounts, or if they discuss Muslims, they take Muslims as a statistical entity or sheer numbers. In contrast, I analyze Muslims as a thinking subject with their own traditions of thought and reasoning. Furthermore, scholars like Sen to peddle, if unconsciously, an orientalizing narrative about Islam through the language of secularism and modernization. This entanglement between Indian studies and Western studies vis-a-vis the scholarship on Islam cannot be ignored. It is precisely for this reason that religion as critique engages with the Western Enlightenment, both the German and the French ones. So the first argument I make is this. Against the dominant views that Islam lacks reason and it is not modern yet, I argue that in different forms and in varying degrees, critique has been integral to Islam. Furthermore, the Enlightenment idea of critique is tied to and is an upshot of a distinct, highly local political anthropological formation, the generalization of which has limited analytical use in other contexts. In fact, it is my contention that Enlightenment considered the reference point for critique and use of reason was an ethnic project because Europe constituted its identity in the name of reason against a series of others, including Islam. My second argument is that in and of itself, reason is neither sufficient nor autonomous in arriving at judgments, which is the original meaning of critique. My third argument, which I make in this book, is that in Islam, reason, which is aql, is highly valued. However, rather than being opposed to emotion and affect, it dwells with the cognate Islamic notion of qalb or dil, heart, or in more general Hindustani man. As Abul Kalam Azad argued, the Quran at once addresses the heart, dil, and mind, dimagh, of its readers. In both Arabic and Urdu tradition, the locus of intellect or reason is not mind, but qalb, heart. Even for Sayyid Ahmad Khan, the greatest champion of reason in 19th century British India, the heart was the locus of doubt as well as satisfaction about philosophical arguments. Finally, religion as critique makes a strong case for extending the practice of critique from the domain of the elite to ordinary subject. It argues that non-intellectuals like Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan and lakhs of ordinary followers of Khudai Khidmatgar too enacted and participated in critique. It also focuses on Indian proverbs as exemplification of critique. However, I do not mean that ordinary individuals and people with PhDs are critics of the same kind. When Gramsci observed that all men are intellectuals, he also said that all of us can and often do make omelets, but all of us are not necessarily cook or master chefs. In short, these are the aims and arguments of religion as critique, and I look forward to comments and questions from the panel and audience. Thank you.
So, before we start with our panelists, so I hear one of our invited panelists, Irfan Ahmad, was unable to come, and he has actually sent a written note on the book, which please.
Religion as Critique is written in a highly unusual yet equally impressive intellectual mode. It makes a serious endeavor to construct a theory of critique and judgment in Islam, by examining those sources and intellectual spaces which are often overlooked. The book offers us a detailed outline of an emerging critical project on Islamic traditions and opens up new vistas of research. The author makes 3 convincing and interconnected claims. Ahmad finds the popular depiction of Islam as an anti-reason, anti-critique doctrine problematic. He situates this global anti-Islamic obsession in the Indian context by offering an intelligent criticism of the contemporary Indian discourse on Islam. His analytical interpretation of Amartya Sen's argumentative Indian is noticeable in this regard.
Thank you very much. I would now like to invite Manisha to please to speak on the book.
Thank you to OUP and Dr. Irfan Ahmad for giving me the opportunity today to reflect on some of the issues out of the book Religion as Critique. Ahmad posits Islam as a critique, drawing upon its own structure, syntax, and reference, a critique which is immanent but never absent. Now, let me focus on 2 ideas to which this immanent critique has been applied. And I speak here as a student of religion rather than pretend to have any knowledge of Islamic traditions at all. Now, the first is the idea of the state, or to speak more expansively, politics. Maududi, as Ahmad has shown in this book as well as in the previous work on the Jamaat-e-Islami, was the preeminent thinker of political Islam, and part of the book's objective is to rescue him from the disparaging label of fundamentalist and to rehabilitate him as a political thinker. Now, 2 things are happening here. Firstly, Ahmad shows that Maududi's framework was Islam and could not have been otherwise because he was speaking from within the tradition. But secondly also that despite this Islamic framework, Ahmad makes a case for recognizing Maududi's critique of Nehru, Congress, or even the League as not a rejection of democracy but only its radicalization. Now, this immediately brings several questions to mind. First is, how does this idea of democracy, this sort of radical idea of democracy, then play out in the Pakistani context? Maududi, of course, as we all know, went over to Pakistan at the time of partition. Now, the second domain in which Ahmad shows the working of this immanent critique is gender. He tells us of the Janus-faced patriarchy of Maududi, granting women membership but limiting their roles and potentialities, and brings out the robust debates on veiling political roles of women and so on, and how ultimately a transformation was brought about in Jamaat's thinking on the question of gender. And lastly, in the acknowledgement and rightful rehabilitation of critique in Islam, the debunking of the universalist claims of enlightenment, how does one ensure that this sort of rehabilitation of critique of the enlightenment category altogether, doesn't lapse into nativism or some kind of indigenous argument, especially in India, where the critics of secularism, and I mean secularism in a very Indian sort of way, the way we use it, romanticize the rise of Hindutva as a mutinous comeback of the subaltern who has been left behind by the enlightenment juggernaut of secular elites' life. And to give it any space is to surrender to colonial consciousness. So the challenge, I think, is how to balance this critique of enlightenment with an altogether, abandoning of the idea of secularism or secular public life. So I think these were my reflections, and I'll just end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your thoughtful comments. Now I will request my former colleague Zia.
Good evening, everybody. There are times in life when you feel thoroughly inadequate. Unfortunately, this is that evening for me. For about 9 years, I was a film critic of The Hindu. Over a period of time, I grew a beard, and Siddharth was among the first ones to call me a Maulana for it. So one fine day, the Imam Sahib was not there in the masjid, and he asked me to lead the prayer. Okay, and I ended up leading the prayer over there, all right. But after the prayer, one joint secretary in Government of India, he again held my hand and he whispered into my ear, "Matinee to Mimbar." Mimbar is the place from which the Imam leads the prayer in a mosque. So I felt very awkward over there. He was a film critic leading the prayers in a masjid where a film critic has no business to be seen. And then with this beard, I would go to a cinema hall, and many thought a Maulana had no business to be seen in the cinema hall. Islam is not a religion which expects you to toe the trite, toe the stereotype 24/7. It's our Maulanas who expect us to do that. Islam, the Quran very clearly asks us again and again to ask questions, to use your reason, to explore the things around you. If, for evidence, there is just one very, very small surah. There is Surah Muhammad, which is probably the 47th surah of the Quran. You read the 24th verse of that. It says, do they not use their reason, or are there locks upon their heart? Coming to Irfan's book, I am an admirer of his craft. A few years ago, he had done a book on Jamaat-e-Islami, and the book opened my eyes towards Jamaat-e-Islami. Like most of us, I had certain preconceived notions of Jamaat-e-Islami, but then he wrote about different madrasas, different units, and I started seeing Jamaat-e-Islami in a different light, so much so that I even started going for their functions. Here I picked up this book by Irfan, and guess what I end up reading first? Jamaat-e-Islami. So it was like more of the same, but actually it was not more of the same. It is completely different. He talked of the early years of Maulana Maududi, something which most of us in the media do not know. You talk of Maulana Maududi, and the first impression you get is of a conservative Muslim leader. But Irfan has dared to go into the details of why. It's very easy to see the finished product, but you have to see the process behind the finished product. And you come back reading this book with a different impression of Maulana Maududi. He talks of Maulana Maududi doing a biography of the father of the nation, and then also another of Pandit Madan Mohan Malviya. Similarly, he said good things about Lala Lajpat Rai getting into All India Trade Union Congress in 1920. So here was one upcoming leader, I would say, in the early 1920s, who was a rationalist to the last bone. How did that change come about? That change came about with something which we are witnessing today. The same thing happened in India in the 20s and 30s with our today's secular Congress party, which was leading the freedom struggle at that time. And Congress party was basically, I would say, guilty, not accused, guilty of bringing about a theo-democracy, of ushering in Hindu nationalism in the garb of Indian nationalism. But what really dissuaded somebody like Maulana Maududi from coming forward in the freedom struggle with Congress was Congress was not ready to differentiate between Hindu nationalism and Indian nationalism. Much like what we hear today about Hindu Rashtra being a symbol of all Indians, where everybody will have his or her own place, but the main dynamic will be of the majority community. The seedbed of acceptance, of acquiescence, unfortunately, was laid in the 1920s and 30s by the Congress party. Remember, at that time, the RSS was still too young to have that kind of impact on our polity. And Jamaat-e-Islami espoused a certain kind of polity which Indian constitution could not agree with. At that time, Maududi was driven by the idea of an Islamic state where Sharia will be paramount, the Lord's will prevail. Today, the same Jamaat-e-Islami works within the Constitution of India. And when I say within the Constitution of India, remember Jamaat-e-Islami is following the work which was done by Dr. Ambedkar.
I think the significance of this book lies in 4 or 5 points that I think are worth reflecting on. The history of critique in Islam, and you look at some of the prominent figures who've had an influence beyond the territories in which they lived and operated. There's no denying the salience of India in the world of Islam. So India as a center for critical thinking about Islam is something very important to bear in mind, and these are of course well-known names. Iqbal is another name. This brings me to my second point about the importance of this book, which is that it is also an act of recovery for Indians across the board. But the fact is that for the majority of Hindus in India, knowledge of Islam as a religion and the tradition of debate, discussion, dialogue, critique is lacking. There is no familiarity with these texts, these names, these ideas, these processes. I would say ignorance about the Islamic tradition of dialogue, debate, and critique is not confined to the lay citizens or lay persons, but even professors. There's a searing critique of Amartya Sen's approach to the argumentative Indian, where Irfan makes the point that the argumentative Muslim is missing from the conception of the argumentative Indian. Third, Irfan has himself described the milieu in which the book got written. A world increasingly marked by Islamophobia, marked by irrational, ahistorical assessments of Islam and the place of Islam and the place of Muslims. And this book is a valuable counter to that kind of stereotyping. But if ever there was a country, if ever there was a land where this stereotyping has taken deep roots and needs to be countered, it is India. This is clearly not a book for lay readers. It's a complex text, a valuable text, but it's a text that will arm scholars, intellectuals, journalists, and others who deal with the, who then can use the material in this book to effectively counter some of the Islamophobic assessments and analyses that are there in the public sphere. So I commend you for this book.
So I want to thank the panelists for their comments. I just want to make 2 quick points. As most of you might have noticed, the title of the book is Religion as Critique. And although I don't have expertise in all the religious tradition, but my general thesis is that religion in general, and I've given some examples from Indian religious tradition, some from Middle Eastern tradition. So the larger thesis of book is about religion in general. It is simply the fact that since my specialization is in a particular tradition, I illustrate that thesis through this specific case. So, for example, I talk about Buddha as critique of his own time. The second point, my intention is clearly not to generate other set of binaries or to posit a totalizing or monolithic entity in opposition to each other. So one of the things is that, of course, about the Enlightenment, you have the Dutch claim that they have their own Enlightenment. There is a Scottish Enlightenment, there is a German Enlightenment, there is a French Enlightenment, and those who talk about Italian Enlightenment and the philosophers who are invoked are people like Vico. So I'm not averse or I'm not indifferent to these different traditions of enlightenment. Of course there are, but at the same time I'm also interested in identifying a certain thread, which is not my imputation, but as reflected in their own comments, what is an underlying thread which connects them. Okay, so it is not to pose a homogeneous totalizing entity. So that is first clarification. One of the striking things which I find, for example, in Mandela's autobiography called A Long Walk, he said that he didn't need to learn practices of democracy from the West. It is from his own tribal tradition that he learned it. But of course, that will not be described as democratic, because democracy is identified with the West. Many people do not know that actually Maududi was one of the first one, and I think it was in the last election in India that some people talked about introducing an idea of right to recall representative. Maududi has already talked about this idea that in a democracy, it should not be the case that once you elect a representative, you are hostage to him or her for good. You should have the right to recall it. But I do not see many people invoking Maududi on this idea, which I think is very central to democracy. To Siddharth's point, I think one could also add, in addition to Iqbal and Ubaidullah Sindhi and Shah Waliullah, one of the figures which has been ignored, namely Hazrat Mohani. Here is a guy who is inspired by Tilak, who writes poetry about Krishna, and at the same time is one of the strong advocates of this idea of Swaraj, and is equally entrenched and committed to Islamic tradition. I mean, my attempt here is not so much to take position or put people into categories, whether it is Israr Ahmad or Javed Gandhi, but to point towards a process of argumentation and then identify the nature and mechanism of the debate. I mean, I'm skeptical of what might be described as classificatory knowledge or a typological knowledge. A typological knowledge is to come with various kind of types and categories and then place there. So that is where I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much. On that note,
Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, I have been a student of political science where we cannot ignore the aspect of philosophy. There is a perception that European Enlightenment has a kind of monopoly over the idea of critique. But Professor Irfan Ahmad does is that he deconstructs that idea and he critiques the idea of critique itself. So I feel that this work is wholly different from what we have been reading, and that's what makes me to feel excited about the release of this book, and I'm looking forward to read the book.
Post-graduation class. In the political philosophy class, one of my professor is taking the political philosophy class, and when I asked, "Sir, is there any philosophy for religion in relation to the politics?" So my professor replied me, "Religion doesn't have any philosophy. Religion doesn't have any idea of critique." So then I kept silence. So there is a kind of fear on Islamic critique, Islamic tradition in academia itself. When you talk about philosophers like Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan, Abul Ala Maududi, or Maulana Abul Kalam Azad, Iqbal, but the brave step by Irfan Ahmad is that he looked into these philosophers as political philosophers, as critical thinkers.
Like, the topics he has touched upon are generally not available to common people, and people don't have much idea. So the research which has been put in has actually gone into making this book a great read.
So I think this book is a very timely response to the totalitarian zeal of Western political and intellectual thought. The book marks a significant departure from the traditional modes of thinking about religion as a critique of the society.
Irfan Ahmad's book Religion as a Critique is an excellent scholarly work, and it challenges some stereotypical understanding of the community. I think it would be greatly appreciated not just by the scholars but a whole range of practitioners, believers and journalists, students,